Hello, friends. Tonight, we will explore a topic that is both shocking and deeply academic. The world of medieval intimacy. A place that was at once personal, perplexing, and at times, utterly bizarre. This was an age of chivalry and gallantry, but also of herbal remedies with highly questionable effects. A time when foreplay might simply have been a polite question, accompanied by the hope that no one was peeking. So, before you settle into your warm blankets, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you find these stories compelling enough, don't hesitate to leave a comment letting me know. Where are you listening from? I'm always curious to know who is joining me on this journey back in time. Now, let's begin by forgetting what you've seen in the movies. If you're imagining a romantic bedroom scene in a castle with flickering candles, a warm fireplace, and flowing white silk curtains, I'm sorry, but that's not the truth. The reality is that the vast majority of medieval Europeans, especially peasants, had only one single room. The floor was just packed earth, always damp and cold, sometimes covered with a layer of dirty straw to hide the mud. The air was thick with smoke from the fire pit in the middle of the house, mixed with the sweat of bodies that hadn't been washed for weeks, the smell of spoiled food, and the scent of damp earth. The entire family ate, slept, cooked, gave birth, raised chickens, and even baked bread right there. There was no concept of a bedroom, let alone a private room. Privacy was a luxury, perhaps on par with Chanel perfume in the 21st century. Imagine a husband and wife whispering by their straw bed. Around them is a symphony of life. The father snores, the mother-in-law's dry cough from the corner, the youngest child's wails for milk, the rustling of rats in the rafters, and the dripping of water from the thatched roof into a pot of boiling potatoes. Want to be intimate? You had to pick the right time, when everyone had fallen into an exhausted sleep, and hope it wasn't so cold that you both had to wear 3 layers of scratchy, stiff woolen clothes. Every eye, though tightly shut, seemed to be watching. And in that single room, the bed was the center of the family universe. But don't think of soft mattresses and warm blankets. In some regions, people had what was called a box bed, which was essentially a large wooden cabinet with doors that could be closed, offering a bit of privacy, but also stuffiness and a lack of air. For the majority, however, a bed was just a pile of straw. The straw wasn't always changed. It was damp, smelled of mildew, rustled with every movement, and was a paradise for bed bugs and fleas. The only blanket, if there was one, was a single piece of rough, itchy wool that the whole family had to share. This bed was where they were born, and where many took their last breath. And curtains. That was a distant dream. A family with enough fabric for curtains would have been considered wealthy. Most had only a thin, tattered piece of cloth, hung loosely as a symbolic reminder of private space. But everyone knew it was just for show. And it doesn't end there. The crowd wasn't just limited to people. Medieval people brought their most valuable animals, cows, sheep, goats, chickens, inside the house every night. The reasons were very practical: to keep both humans and animals warm with each other's body heat, and more importantly, to prevent theft. And so, at night, the pungent smell of animal manure filled the air. You could be awakened by the sound of a cow chewing its cud right next to your ear, or the feeling of a chicken jumping on you to lay an egg. In this context, adult matters had to take place in the presence of the entire family and the entire barnyard. One movement too strong, one gasp too loud, could wake up both people and animals. That was at home. What if you had to travel? The inns of that time were no better. If you were a merchant or a pilgrim, don't expect a private room. You would be assigned to a large bed where you had to share space with complete strangers. Tonight, you might sleep next to a mercenary reeking of alcohol. The next night, a monk muttering prayers all night long. The bedsheet, if there was one, was yellowed and hadn't been washed in who knows how long. Sharing a bed was normal, and conversations often began with, "Excuse me, which way are you facing, so I can avoid your morning breath?" We have journeyed through the prisons of the mind, the barriers of society, the laws of the church. Now, in the final chapter of this chronicle, let us confront the most naked and physical truth, an invisible barrier yet present in every breath. Scent. Or more accurately, the absence of the concept of personal hygiene as we know it today. Forget the image of marble-tiled bathrooms with steamy hot water. For most medieval people, a full-body bath was a rare event, sometimes happening only a few times a year. Clean water was precious, and firewood to heat it was even more expensive. People might wash their faces and hands daily, but soaking in a tub was a luxury reserved for the super rich. Even kings and queens bathed only about once a month. So what happens when an entire society doesn't bathe regularly? The answer is simple. Everyone smelled. It wasn't an unusually offensive odor, but a collective scent of the entire community. It was a complex mixture of unwashed sweat, smoke from the hearth that clung to clothes, the smell of livestock living in the house, the scent of damp earth, and the odor of woolen or leather clothes that were never properly washed. In this context, physical intimacy took on a completely different dimension. When two people came together at night, they brought not only love or desire, but also their own ecosystem of scents. And since everyone was the same, it seemed no one complained. It was like us today, not complaining that the air has oxygen. Body odor was an inevitable part of existence. Of course, people were still conscious of smell. The nobility and the wealthy tried every means to eliminate unwanted odors and create pleasant ones. They chewed fragrant herbs like mint or cloves for fresh breath. Women carried small silver or gold orbs, called pomanders, filled with musk, ambergris, or fragrant resins. When passing through smelly places, they would hold the pomander to their nose. They also applied perfumes made from rose or lavender oil to their clothes and hair. But for the common people, these solutions were a distant dream. Their best way to deodorize was to use what was available, crushing a handful of mint leaves and rubbing them on their body, or hanging bunches of dried lavender in their homes. And so, the saying, "True love is blind," in the Middle Ages should probably be revised to "True love is nose blind." It required a complete acceptance of the other person, in the most literal sense. You couldn't love a clean, perfumed version of that person. You had to love them as they were, with all the very human scents they carried. Perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion to this chronicle. After passing through all the spiritual and social barriers, the final barrier was the most basic, the most primal. And perhaps it was in the acceptance of the imperfect, the very earthly, that love truly found its essence. It was not a lofty ideal or a romantic poem. It was the closeness of two bodies, two souls, two scents, merging into one in the darkness of a straw-roofed room, finding there a little warmth to get through the long, cold night of life. So, in such a crowded and noisy space, how could people be intimate? Ah, that was an art in itself, the art of silence and patience. They had to wait for a storm to come, for the roar of the rain or the clap of thunder to drown out all other sounds. They communicated with their eyes, with a discreet touch of the hand under the rough blanket. They had to act as if nothing had happened the next morning, facing the scrutinizing eyes of the whole family. Being discovered was not just embarrassing. It could mean being reprimanded by the local priest in front of the entire congregation at Sunday service. Yet, love does not live on will alone. In that poor and cramped world, there were still touching stories. Couples who quietly nurtured the dream of one day building their own house with a door to close and a bed just for two. Their love was not written into poetry, not preserved in letters, but it existed quietly, persistently, and sometimes more intensely than the love songs of the nobility. They loved not for show. They loved to survive, amidst the cold and sorrow, amidst the smell of damp straw and the crowing of roosters. Love was the small flame that helped them feel human, an affirmation that even in the worst circumstances, the desire to connect, to belong to someone, still burned brightly. It was a raw, unadorned love, but perhaps, for that very reason, it was more real than ever. If in part one, we felt the cold of the earthen floor, the stuffiness of the thatched roof, and the presence of livestock, now, please step with me through another threshold. Let's leave behind those physical limitations to face a prison far more solid and terrifying. The prison of the mind, of faith, and of fear. The warden of this prison did not carry a sword or wear armor, but was cloaked in the robes of sanctity. That was the Roman Catholic Church. Their power was not just in towering stone cathedrals or vast lands. Their real power lay in their ability to penetrate the deepest corners of the human soul and erect invisible walls right between two lovers. The bedroom, which should have been the safest and most private sanctuary, was turned into a grand stage, a public courtroom before the eyes of God. Every touch, every breath, every beat of a yearning heart was recorded, not in a love diary, but in a colossal book of sins that each person had to carry themselves to Judgment Day. To understand this extreme intervention, we must go back in time, back to the root of a fear that haunted a millennium. It was the fear of original sin. For medieval people, the story of Adam and Eve was not an ancient legend. It was an obvious truth, a hereditary curse flowing in the veins of every child born. They were taught that the act of eating the forbidden fruit was not just an act of disobedience, but that it opened the door to lust, concupiscentia, the demon of carnal desire, which had tainted the pure nature of humanity. And the means by which that demon was passed from generation to generation was none other than the act of physical union. St. Augustine, one of the greatest but also most complex minds of the Church, who had lived a passionate youth before his conversion, shaped this thinking. In his Confessions, he wrestled with his own desires. He had an unofficial wife for 15 years and a son, Adeodatus. The pain and inner turmoil of having to abandon them to live a chaste life were deeply etched into his ideology. For Augustine, it was the pleasure in physical intimacy, the moment when reason is clouded by passion. That was the clearest symptom of the fall. It was a fever of the soul, a loss of control that reminded humans they were no longer pure as they were at the beginning. Therefore, physical intimacy was seen as a regrettable concession. It was a necessary act to propagate the species, to create new souls for the church, so that those souls could be baptized and saved from the very sin that created them. A tragic and paradoxical cycle. Marriage was elevated to a sacrament, not to celebrate conjugal love, but as a remedium concupiscentiae, a cure for lust, a license to perform an inherently sinful act for a higher purpose. Anyone who engaged in it for pleasure, for connection, for the warmth of a loved one on a cold winter's night was committing a mortal sin. They were placing their own pleasure above the sacred purpose ordained by God, and the price for that pleasure was the fire of hell. This pessimistic view of human nature did not stop at sermons in church. It crept into the bedroom, transforming into an invisible code of law, binding people in how they touched each other and when they were allowed to do so. Imagine you are a young husband, deeply in love with your wife. Night falls, and in the flickering candlelight, you want to embrace your wife in a new way, a way you think will express all your tenderness. But then, the voice of the priest from last Sunday's service echoes in your ear. Any position other than the man on top is an imitation of beasts, an upheaval of God's order. And just like that, all passion cools. Only one position was acceptable, the common position. The man on top, sowing the seed. The woman below, receiving. It was not just a physical position. It was a symbol of the cosmic order. God above man, and man above woman. Any change was seen as a heaven and earth-shattering rebellion. The woman on top, a horrifying image. It was the sign of a wanton woman, wanting to usurp the power of men, to actively seek pleasure for herself, an act of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Other positions? That was to degrade human dignity, God's noblest gift, to the level of animals. That was the sin of Sodom. Other forms not aimed at procreation? That was the ultimate sin, the sin of unnatural acts, for they served only pure lust, a blatant blasphemy against the Creator's plan. Love, with its myriad emotional nuances, was forced into a single, rigid, soulless mold designed to produce the least amount of pleasure possible. Even after obediently adhering to the correct position, the battle was not over. The church also laid out a dark calendar, a labyrinth of prohibitions, turning marital intimacy into a rare privilege. Let's flip through the calendar of a medieval peasant's life. Sundays were forbidden, the Lord's Day. Wednesdays and Fridays were forbidden. Fasting days, the entire season of Lent, 40 days before Easter, was a time of penance, absolutely forbidden. The entire season of Advent, 4 weeks before Christmas, was a sacred waiting period, forbidden. The weeks around Pentecost were also forbidden. Every day of the year had a saint to be honored, and on important feast days, physical intimacy was also considered inappropriate. When the wife was menstruating, forbidden. When the wife was pregnant, forbidden, for fear that lust would harm the fetus. After childbirth, the wife had to undergo 40 days of purification, forbidden. And so it went, day after day, week after week. The net of prohibitions grew ever tighter. Do a simple calculation, and a devout couple was left with only about 40-50 legal nights out of 365 days. Love could not flourish naturally. It was suppressed, scheduled, turned into a duty to be performed hastily and anxiously in the rare gaps allowed by the rulebook. But humans are not saints. There would be times when instinct won, an embrace that went too far on a forbidden night. In that case, the only escape for a soul trembling with sin was the confessional. Don't imagine it as a warm place to share. Imagine a small, dark, stuffy wooden box separating you from the priest by a latticed screen. You kneel, and the voice from the other side begins, not to comfort, but to interrogate. Tell me, my child, what sin have you committed? Father, I was with my wife. On what day? Was it a holy day? How many times? In what position? The one God allows, or the one of Satan? Did you feel pleasure in that sinful act? Did you seek out private enjoyment? Each question was like a knife cut to one's self-esteem. You had to expose your most intimate private moments, turning them into evidence against yourself. Priests had in their hands penitentials, which listed in detail hundreds of types of physical sins and their corresponding penances. And the punishment was not just a few whispered prayers. It was public humiliation. For a light offense, fasting on bread and water for weeks. For a more serious one, wearing sackcloth, sprinkling ashes on your head, and walking barefoot around the church before the curious, pitying, or contemptuous eyes of neighbors. The most severe was excommunication from the community, or having to undertake an arduous pilgrimage of thousands of miles, lasting for years. Many also believed that only physical pain could wash away the stain on the soul. They voluntarily whipped their own backs with leather scourges until they bled, hoping the groans of the body would drown out the sinful whispers in their soul. Yet, there was a stark truth, a most bitter hypocrisy, hanging right over their heads, right in the very church where they sought salvation. The people who made the rules, who held the scales of morality, the priests who preached about purity, were often the ones who broke them. The ideal of clerical celibacy was, in reality, often just a tragicomedy. History and folklore are filled with stories of the priest's niece or housekeeper, whom everyone knew was actually his unofficial wife, of fatherless children growing up in the village with faces identical to the venerable priest. Some bishops were even so sophisticated as to impose a cradle tax, collegium, a fine that priests had to pay for having children, turning sin into a source of income. The peasant trembled as he confessed to an embrace with his wife and received a heavy penance. Meanwhile, the priest, after granting him absolution, might return to his own secret family. That injustice, that hypocrisy, hung like a toxic cloud over all of medieval society, but no one dared to expose it. So there we have it, a full circle in that spiritual prison. The love of medieval people, already struggling in material hardship, was now shackled by dogma, judged by fear, and torn apart by hypocrisy. The bedroom was no longer a private paradise for two, but had become a battleground between heaven and hell, between primal instinct and man-made laws in the name of God. But the journey into this stormy private realm is not over. After the soul was bound by the church, their bodies were about to face another expert, one who spoke not of sin, but of hot, cold, dry, wet. That was the medieval healer, with his remedies and supportive methods that just hearing about them could make you lose all desire. In the perpetual flow of human history, the quest for physical and spiritual harmony has always been a complex chapter. If the first chapters were about the struggle with external circumstances, with social dogmas and prejudices, then this next chapter is a silent dialogue with one's own body, mediated by a special figure, the healer, or the physician of the pre-scientific era. This is not the image of a physician in a pristine white coat that posterity imagines. The physician of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance appears as a character from ancient books. His figure is often associated with a dark robe, smelling faintly of damp earth and dried leaves. His face is etched with the wrinkles of contemplation, his deep-set eyes seeming to hold the knowledge of generations, and around his waist is a worn leather pouch containing a world of roots, seeds, mysterious powders, and strange minerals. He had no machines, no testing tools. His only weapons were observation, inherited experience, and a system of medical theory that had existed for thousands of years. When a person came to him with concerns about a cooling in their marital life, they were not just seeking a remedy. They were seeking an answer to a mystery they could not explain themselves. This was an era where science had not yet clearly distinguished between the physical and the spiritual, between hormones and temperament. Any trouble in the bedroom, from indifference to an inability to perform, was attributed to a deeper cause, an imbalance of the fundamental elements that constituted life. To understand the remedies and advice of the physicians of that time, we need to understand their medical worldview. Its foundation was the theory of humors, a great legacy from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory held that the microcosm within the human body was governed by four main fluids, each with its own properties and influence on a person's temperament. First was blood, possessing the qualities of hot and wet. People with a sanguine temperament were often lively, optimistic, had a rosy complexion, and an abundant source of vitality. They were people with a vibrant, sometimes intense, emotional life. Second was yellow bile, representing the element of fire, with the qualities of hot and dry. People with a choleric temperament were often strong, decisive, but also quick to anger and irritable. Their vitality was abundant, but lacked softness and gentleness. Third was black bile, with the qualities of cold and dry. This was a temperament of melancholic, pensive souls. An excess of black bile was thought to be the cause of melancholy, making the body weak, pale, and lose all interest in life, including worldly pleasures. Their bodies were likened to a barren land that needed to be nourished and warmed. Finally, there was phlegm, with the qualities of cold and wet. This temperament produced calm, gentle people, sometimes a bit slow and passive. The fire of their desire was often suppressed by the dampness and coldness of their body, making it difficult to burn intensely. Health, therefore, was a state of perfect balance, a symphony in which these four humors blended harmoniously. And when a patient came, the physician would begin his sophisticated diagnosis. He would look at the skin color, check the clarity of the eyes, listen to the breath, and examine the color of bodily excretions. A pale face, dark circles under the eyes, could be a sign that cold and dry humors were dominant. A yellowish complexion could indicate an excess of yellow bile. From there, a treatment was prescribed, not targeting the symptom, but aiming to restore the lost balance. From this theoretical foundation, a treasure trove of remedies for intimate problems was born. They were a crystallization of botanical knowledge, belief in symbolism, and sometimes a rich imagination. One of the most treasured remedies was sparrow brain mixed with dandelion root. The sparrow, with its liveliness and fertility, was considered a symbol of abundant vitality. Its brain, therefore, was believed to contain the essence of mental stimulation. Dandelion root, with its bitter taste and hot nature, was thought to purify the body and promote blood circulation. This combination was believed to awaken the mind and direct blood flow to where it was needed. However, preparing and consuming this remedy was a real challenge. It had a strong and unfamiliar taste, requiring the patient to have great courage and a strong faith in the physician. Another, more daring remedy was using the urine of a female goat in heat, mixed with honey and turmeric. The goat, a symbol of intense desire in many cultures, was believed to possess a powerful yang energy. Its urine during this special period was believed to be a natural love potion, capable of awakening the most lethargic bodies. Honey was added to soothe, and turmeric to enhance the hot quality. The actual effect of this remedy, however, was often a strong and distinctive odor, sometimes creating an unwanted distance between two souls yearning to be close. Besides oral remedies, there were also external methods. For example, black cumin seeds were burned to charcoal and mixed with ash from the spouse's hair. This mixture was not to be eaten, but gently rubbed on the lower abdomen. Cumin seeds were hot, and hair ash was a symbol of deep connection. This ritual was believed to create an invisible bond, helping to absorb energy from the universe and make two people more energetically compatible. In addition to prescribing medicine, the healer was also a counselor, a sage who gave guidance for private life, based on the harmony between humans and nature. They advised that couples should avoid intimacy on full moon nights. Because the moon affects the tides, and since the human body is mostly water, the energy of the full moon was thought to increase dampness, which could lead to an unstable mental state and easily produce children with a melancholic or sleepwalking temperament. To conceive a son, a common piece of advice was for the husband to drink a little warm wine mixed with a few drops of a male goat's blood. The logic behind it was clear in the contemporary mindset. Male goat blood was the essence of yang energy, of hot and dry qualities. Absorbing it would enhance male characteristics, thereby increasing the chances of conceiving a boy. When a marriage was not harmonious, they might advise people to boil a handful of warm herbs, like perilla or rosemary, and use the steam to fumigate the bedroom. The scent of the herbs was believed to dispel evil spirits, calm the anger caused by yellow bile, and bring a gentle, relaxed atmosphere to the room. However, not all methods were harmless. In the effort to find more powerful solutions for difficult cases, the line between healing and harming was sometimes blurred. Some daring physicians used small doses of mercury, believing that this flexible liquid metal could stir and awaken the vital energy in a sluggish body. They did not know that they were introducing a terrible neurotoxin into the patient's body. The result was not a revival of desire, but a depletion from within, a silent devastation of the nervous system and internal organs. For those diagnosed as too hot, an extreme cooling method might be applied. The patient was required to place cold stones on their body and meditate in the cold air, with the aim of re-establishing yin-yang balance. In reality, this thermal shock therapy often led to respiratory illnesses, weakening the body and extinguishing the last sparks of vitality. When we look back at these pages of history from a modern perspective, a smile might appear on our lips at the naivety of the remedies and advice. But perhaps it would be a mistake to see them only through the lens of humor, because behind every strange remedy, every irrational piece of advice, was a sincere effort. It was the effort of people living in a world still full of mystery, trying to use their limited knowledge to decipher one of the most basic human desires, the desire to be connected, to be loved, and to be happy. The healer, with his leather pouch and theories of hot, cold, wet, dry, became a spiritual anchor. He listened to the sorrows that people dared not express elsewhere. He offered an explanation, a direction, and most importantly, he brought hope. In that hazy world of knowledge, sometimes the belief in healing itself was a more effective medicine than any other. And so, their story is not just a strange chapter in the history of medicine, but also a moving testament to the never-ending human journey of self-discovery. A journey that was clumsy, naive, but always full of a primal and beautiful aspiration. You think only God, clerics, and healers were prying into private lives? Wrong. There was another character, the peeper. Not a demon, not a shaman, but neighbors, the village chief, and even friends you thought were close. The Middle Ages had no security cameras. There were no sophisticated listening devices hidden in the walls, nor was there a global positioning system to track every step. But if anyone thinks that the absence of technology meant a world of privacy, that is a profound misunderstanding of the nature of history. Because in that world, where physical and social space merged into one, it was people themselves who were the most perfect and curious surveillance devices. The monitoring came not from inanimate machines, but from judging eyes and storytelling ears. This surveillance had two layers, operating in parallel and perfectly complementing each other. The first layer, ceremonial and systematic, took place in the darkness of the church. At the end of each week, a person's anxiety was not just, "What is my spouse thinking?" but a much more frightening question. What does the priest know? Inside the cramped, dark, and stuffy space of the confessional, a sacred yet stressful ritual took place. It was not just about confessing common faults like a lie or a greedy act, but a detailed interrogation about the most hidden corners of one's marital life. It was not a gentle confession like, "Father, I have had impure thoughts." No, it was an in-depth interview that would astonish any modern journalist with its level of detail. The priest, in his role as a spiritual guide, was trained to ask direct questions, getting straight to the heart of sins of the flesh. They had in their hands penitentials, which listed hundreds of different physical sins, along with corresponding penances for each. And to assign guilt accurately, they had to ask, "How many times have you been intimate with your spouse this past week? In what position did you perform this act? Was it the position permitted by God or another? Did you experience pleasure in that act? How long did that pleasure last? At that moment, did your mind wander to any other image? Did you take pleasure in the very sin you committed?" To modern people, these questions are a blatant invasion of privacy. but in the context of the time, it was considered a spiritual responsibility. It was believed that for a sin to be fully forgiven, it had to be fully exposed, with no detail hidden. The goal of confession was to free the soul, but the method sometimes felt like a form of mental torture. The peasant or craftsman had to struggle to find words to describe things that had no name, exposing their weakest moments to a man they both respected and feared. And if the confessor naively believed that what was said in the dark would forever stay in the dark, they forgot a simple truth. The priest was also part of the community. The line between the confessor and the keeper of the village's secrets became incredibly thin. And a secret, once shared, always risked finding its way into the light, even if only through hints and innuendos. What was confessed in the confessional today could, the next day, become a story cleverly whispered in a corner of the market with the familiar opening. I'm not naming names, but I hear that in our parish there is someone. If the surveillance from the church was periodic and somewhat ceremonial, the second layer of surveillance was constant, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was the monitoring from neighbors. In cramped rural communities, where families lived huddled together in one-room houses, privacy was a luxury. The walls of mud, bamboo, or thin wood were not barriers, but sound filters, just enough to make every noise ambiguous and more stimulating to curiosity. Shared living spaces, straw beds placed side by side, common courtyards, the village well, where everyone drew water, the communal oven, where housewives gathered, all created ideal conditions for the smallest movement to become a topic for a whole session of analysis. Last night, I heard the bed in their house creaking, and I'm sure it wasn't the rats. She was late for church this morning, looking haggard. She must have had a hard night's work. Rumors in this period spread faster than the plague. A faint moan seeping through the wall was enough for the whole village to know by morning. A single absence from Sunday morning service was enough for people to come up with a series of theories about the reason. And in this spontaneous surveillance system, women were often the most scrutinized subjects. A woman's smile was not just joy, it was a signal to be decoded. A wife who smiled more than usual might be thought to be surely being well loved by her husband. An unmarried girl walking happily through the village might be suspected of definitely sneaking around with someone. More tragically, a wife who remained childless after years of marriage had to face cruel whispers that her husband has a problem, or she herself is not a complete woman. In such a world, personal happiness was sometimes a dangerous thing. Because if you were happy openly while others were not, you would immediately become an object of suspicion and envy. This surveillance became even more intense when it came to marriage, because marriage in this period was rarely the culmination of a romantic love. It was a profoundly economic, political, and social event. Therefore, whether a couple was intimate or not was no longer a matter for two people, but a common concern for the entire community, for both families. Neighbors watched to see if the new bride had the look of a married woman. Relatives counted the days and months to see if the couple was compatible and fulfilling their duty of continuing the family line. The whole village awaited news of the wife's pregnancy, because if the good news came too early, before the wedding, or too late, long after the wedding. It would raise questions and informal investigations. And if there was any doubt about the fulfillment of the duty on the wedding night, a public and terrifying ritual could be conducted: the bed inspection. Yes, it was a literal inspection. In some places, right after the couple's first night, older female family members, usually the mothers, would enter the bridal chamber to inspect the bedsheet. They looked for traces of blood, proof of the bride's virginity and the consummation of the marriage. If the sheet was suspiciously pristine, a cloud of suspicion would immediately descend. The bride was placed in the position of a deceiver. Her family lost all honor, and the entire marriage was at risk of being annulled. The pinnacle of this surveillance culture was when rumors, what people overheard through the walls, could be used as a form of evidence in village or church courts. In the records of medieval trials, one can find cases that we would consider absurd today. A wife could be accused of adultery simply because a neighbor heard her laughing with another man late at night. A man could be sued for fornication when he was discovered breathing too heavily next to a widow's bed. Folk tales even exaggerated this reality to the point of absurdity, but they reflected an underlying truth. In a community where everyone knew each other, reputation was everything, and a whisper had devastating power. Why did a society operate this way? The answer lies in the nature of the era itself, a time of fear, of cramped living spaces, and of an almost absolute system of social control. People feared God, feared hell, feared the punishment of the law, but perhaps the most constant and haunting fear was the fear of the eyes and words of their neighbors. When individual power was almost non-existent, the power of the collective reigned supreme. And in that society, maintaining a moral image in the eyes of everyone was often more important than seeking true happiness. Medieval love was not just imprisoned in cramped rooms. It was also suffocated by the gaze of the world, by the weight of rumors, and by the whispers that accidentally slipped through the thin straw walls. But the story is not over. In the next part, we will pull back the curtain on one of the most shocking truths about ancient society. Medieval marriage, in most cases, was not the result of love. It was a contract. Not a contract of affection, but an economic, political, diplomatic, and sometimes even a tool for revenge. My dear friend, before we sigh at the lack of romance in modern relationships, let's turn back the pages of history to the Middle Ages. There, a loveless marriage was not a personal tragedy, but a common reality, a social institution. And in comparison, we may realize that our lives today, though sometimes imperfect, are still a privilege that many in the past dared not dream of. Erase from your mind the image of proposals by candlelight, sparkling engagement rings, and heartfelt vows. Medieval marriage, especially among the common people, rarely began with the words, "I do, because I love you to the ends of the earth." Instead, it was determined by a much more practical dialogue, often taking place between fathers, the heads of families, perhaps by a flickering fire after a long day of hard labor. This girl will bring a dowry of 2 acres of land, 5 hens, and a cow. Her family has a good reputation, and importantly, she has no brothers to dispute the inheritance. We agree to proceed with the wedding. Yes, marriage was a transaction. One side provided land, livestock, or a sum of money as a dowry. The other side guaranteed a clean bloodline. a woman capable of bearing children and managing the household. The two families shook hands, and the agreement was sealed with a shared cup of wine and a solemn nod from the elders. And what about the bride and groom? They were often just supporting characters in their own life stories. In many cases, they had never met more than 3 times before the wedding day. Sometimes, their first meeting was the moment they stood next to each other at the altar, declared husband and wife under the witness of God and the entire community. If you could travel back in time and ask a 14th century peasant woman, "Ma'am, did you marry for love?" she would most likely look at you with astonishment, as if you had just said something from another world. "Love," she might reply, "that's only for wandering poets and idle ladies and gentlemen of the nobility." For the common people, whose lives were a constant struggle against poverty and disease, marriage was a means of survival. Men married to have someone to cook, weave, care for the children, and help with farm work. Women married to have a roof over their heads, protection, and a place in society, and feelings like a racing heart, dry lips, eyes that can't look away. Those were considered extravagant, frivolous, even dangerous expressions, things that usually only appeared in clandestine affairs outside of marriage. In many families, the marital relationship operated like a labor partnership. They called each other not by pet names, but by their function in the family: father of the children, mistress of the granary, mother of the bedwetter. Their bond was not built on romantic feelings, but on mutual respect in work and shared responsibilities. And if one day a husband suddenly said, "I feel happy when I'm with my wife," the whole village might look at him with surprise, as if he had just said something that went against the normal order of things. If for the common people, marriage was a tool for survival, for the nobility, it was also a powerful strategic weapon. Every marriage in the upper class was a move on the vast political chessboard of Europe. Want to end a long-standing war with a neighboring lord? Marry your beloved daughter to your enemy's son. The result was 2 young people who did not know each other at all, having to live together just because their fathers once hated each other. Want to expand your territory without bloodshed? Find a way to marry a wealthy widow who has just inherited a large estate. Love was not necessary. The only thing that mattered was the legal inheritance that the marriage brought. Were you publicly humiliated by someone? One of the most sophisticated forms of revenge was to force your sister or daughter to marry that person's son. That way, the enemy not only became a family member, but was also placed in a lower position, becoming your son-in-law. Marriage was used to transfer power, to seal alliances, to resolve feuds, and sometimes to punish descendants for the mistakes of their ancestors. And at the center of all these macro calculations, there was often the image of eyes red from crying all through the wedding night, a silent sacrifice for the benefit of the family. In this system, women, especially noble ladies, rarely had a choice. Their age of marriage was often very young, sometimes only 12 or 14, an age that today is still considered a child. Early marriage was intended to ensure the bride's chastity and maximum fertility. And free love? That was a dangerous concept. If a girl fell in love with someone not in her family's plan, that act could upset an entire political strategy, losing a lucrative alliance. And so, tragic life stories unfolded. A girl who was playing with her friends yesterday had to wear a heavy wedding dress today, standing next to a man her father's age. A young woman with dreams of becoming an artisan was married off to a disabled knight just to preserve the honor of a distant branch of the family. Women were seen as a valuable commodity, but not to be cherished, but to be priced, bargained for, and exchanged on the chessboard of men's power. However, could such an iron system completely extinguish the natural fire in the human heart? History shows that it could not. Amidst the cold picture of arranged marriages, love still found a way to sprout, even if only through the smallest cracks. It was the hurried glances through a crack in the door, a wildflower secretly left in a basket of turnips, a small piece of paper hastily written with a piece of charcoal and hidden carefully under the dry straw. It was the love songs that minstrels sang for a dream lover, someone they could never marry. A few brave couples dared to follow the call of their hearts, running away together and living a life considered criminal by society. Many others accepted their fate, living their whole lives next to someone they did not love, but still reserving a small corner of their soul to cherish the image of a first love they were forced to leave behind. Because, no matter how harsh human laws are, the heart has its own reasons that no contract can control. And then, in the context of these loveless marriages, what was the most valuable asset, the guarantee of a woman's and her family's honor? It was not knowledge, not kindness, not talent. It was a delicate membrane deep inside her body. In the next part, we will delve into the medieval obsession with chastity, a concept that was both deified and commercialized, and sometimes abused to the point of absurdity. If the previous chapters have shown us that marriage was a contract, this chapter will explore the most important collateral, the invisible currency that determined the value of that contract, a woman's chastity. If you think that chastity is merely a moral concept, in the Middle Ages, it was also a tangible asset, a moral license, a certificate of family honor, and a commodity that had to be carefully sealed, thoroughly inspected, and sometimes cleverly faked. The lesson a medieval girl heard from a young age was not, "You must love yourself, you must study to become wise, and you must choose a man worthy of you." Instead, the whispers, the admonitions she heard every day were, "You must keep yourself, because if you lose it before marriage, you not only disgrace yourself, but you are bringing shame upon the honor of your entire family." Chastity was not a personal issue. It was a public asset, belonging to her parents, to both sides of the family, to the entire village, and even to the priest who oversaw the parish. In a world without DNA testing, the bride's purity was the only proof to ensure that the first child she bore was indeed the blood of her husband, the legal heir of the family. It was the foundation for the transfer of property and the maintenance of patriarchal order. Therefore, losing one's chastity before marriage was not only seen as an immoral act, but was also considered a bankruptcy of honor for an entire collective. The consequences for a girl who was no longer intact were devastating. She had almost no chance of marrying a decent man. Her dowry would be reduced or rejected entirely. In many cases, she could be disowned by her family, thrown out of her home, and in some harsh regions, she could even face public punishment, being stoned to death. The pressure to protect this asset led to the emergence of a series of testing methods that we today find absurd and superstitious. These were unwritten tests conducted by examiners who were her own relatives or the village midwives. The most common and well-known method was the inspection of the bedsheet after the wedding night. The morning after the wedding, a group of older women from both families would enter the room to check. The sheet had to have bloodstains. If it was suspiciously pristine, a cloud of suspicion would immediately descend. The bride was placed in the position of a deceiver. Her family lost all honor, and the entire marriage was at risk of being annulled. In addition, there were methods based on observation and folklore. It was believed that a chaste girl would walk with a gentle, demure gait. A walk that was too brisk, decisive, and confident could be interpreted as a sign of someone who was experienced. In some places, they even performed a cold water test, believing that a girl who had lost her chastity would not get goosebumps when dipping her hands in cold water. Therefore, on a cold winter day, a girl's good tolerance could become evidence against her. There were even places where girls were given a special herbal tea, and their body's reaction was used to guess whether the virgin spirit still resided within. Here, we can clearly see that it was not chastity itself, but the myth woven around it that was the shackle and control over a woman's life. Where there is a harsh rule, there will be ways to get around it. The honor restoration surgery industry may sound modern, but its early versions existed since the Middle Ages. Faced with the risk of losing everything, many girls and their families had to resort to secret and risky solutions. Some midwives, healers practicing in secret, developed techniques to fake the evidence of chastity. They might use animal blood, usually chicken blood, soaked in a thin piece of cloth or a small sponge, then use vegetable glue to cleverly place it in the woman's body before the wedding night. Another method was to create chastity pills, small capsules containing dried blood, which would break upon impact to create a fake scene. The cost of these services was extremely high, and the risk of infection, even death, was very high. But many girls were forced to risk their lives because it was the only gamble they could take to save not only their honor, but also their lives. The obsession with chastity created countless tragedies. There were girls who were victims of violence, but instead of being protected by society, they were condemned by that same community as consenting, as having voluntarily lost their honor. There were men who, wanting to destroy the reputation of an enemy family, spread rumors that they had slept with the enemy's daughter. No proof was needed, just a word, a whisper sowing doubt, was enough for a family's honor to collapse like a besieged fortress. And perhaps the most tragic were the cases of girls who were still chaste, but for some biological reason could not produce proof on their wedding night, or accidentally failed an absurd test. They had to live the rest of their lives in the humiliation and coldness of the community. Because in that era, the truth was sometimes less important than the collective belief. And that belief, as thin as a membrane, had the weight of an invisible dumbbell tied to a woman's life. This obsession existed not only in secular life, but was also reinforced and elevated to a new level by the church. Chastity was turned into a symbol of purity and holiness. Nuns had to vow to remain chaste for life to be considered brides of Christ. Many female saints, like Saint Agnes or Saint Cecilia, were venerated and became role models for all women for bravely defending their chastity until death. Many self-flagellated, cut their hair, wore hair shirts, and practiced austere fasting, all just to keep their bodies pure. Chastity was no longer a quality. It had become a title, proof of piety, and a ticket to heaven. However, amidst a world dominated by fear and control, there were still flames of resistance. There were still girls who dared to love, dared to choose, dared to confront an entire system to live true to their hearts. They dared to say, "My body is not something for you to price based on a few drops of blood." They were a small minority. They may have been cursed, ostracized, forgotten in the official histories, but they were the first cracks, breaking the fortress wall of control over women's bodies. And today, as we retell this story, they need to be remembered, not because they kept or lost something, but because they kept the courage to be human. When proof of chastity became the ultimate moral certificate, what happened to those who could not produce that diploma, whether by fate or by choice? Was there any path to forgiveness for them? The answer is yes. But the price to pay was not prayers or tears of repentance. It was public punishment with their own bodies. In the next chapter, we will step into a place called the confessional, but which was in fact a stage for physical punishment. A place where an act of love could lead to the lashes of a whip, ashes smeared on the body, and bloody bare feet walking around the church before the eyes of the entire community. In the modern world, we take for granted that what happens behind closed doors, the most intimate feelings and behaviors, are part of an inviolable private domain. Who I love, how I love, where and when. That's my own business. But in the Middle Ages, you had no own business, because the church not only observed your behavior from the outside, they also required you to report it yourself, in detail, down to every breath, every most secret thought. And if that report deviated from strict doctrines, the punishment would not just be kneeling in prayer, but could be blood and tears. Inside the dark, stuffy wooden box called the confessional, an unequal dialogue took place. The parishioner was not allowed to speak in general terms like, "Father, I have made a mistake. I am now sincerely repentant. Please pray for my soul." No, that was not a confession, but an interrogation. The priest, in his role as a soul searcher, would ask a series of detailed questions, delving into the corners one most wanted to hide. What is the name of the partner with whom you have sinned? How many times have you been intimate with each other this past week? On what day did this act take place? Did it fall during Lent or a saint's feast day? During that time, did you feel pleasure? Did you look into each other's eyes? Did you whisper any words? Confession had turned into an investigation into the nature of personal pleasure. Every detail exposed was not to be understood, but to be analyzed, dissected, and judged. The ultimate goal was not forgiveness, but total control over one of the most basic and powerful human instincts. To ensure consistency in judgment, the church created special manuals called penitentials. These were truly the black books of intimate life, listing hundreds of different physical sins, along with corresponding penances, prescribed in detail. For example, a peasant who was intimate with his wife on a holy day might have to fast for 30 days. Using a position considered unnatural could lead to multiple confessions and kneeling before the altar for hours. And perhaps the most unbelievable thing for us today, feeling excessive pleasure during marital relations was also considered a sin, and the punishment could be to whip one's own back with a leather scourge every morning. In this system of thought, physical happiness was equated with the fall. Pleasure was believed to be the product of the devil, a trap to lure people away from God's path, and a passionate, intense love between a husband and wife, instead of being celebrated, was seen as an act of rebellion against sacred control. Confession was only the beginning. After the sin was diagnosed, the soul's patient had to undergo treatment, that is, to suffer punishment. And these punishments were not light. They were designed to cause physical pain, through which the soul was believed to be purified. At a light level, the sinner might have to fast for a long period, eating only dry bread and water throughout the 40 days of Lent. They might have to wear a shirt made of rough cloth, sprinkle ashes on their head, and walk in silence around the church, not allowed to communicate with anyone. At a medium level, the punishment became harsher. The person might have to kneel on sharp stones or dried beans for hours until their knees were swollen and bleeding. Or they had to stand before the altar with their arms raised to the sky until they were exhausted and fainted. At the most severe level, the punishment was public and humiliating. The sinner had to wear a sign that read "Sinner" on their chest, walking through the village so that others could spit on them and recite prayers for their salvation. The most terrible punishment was probably self-flagellation with a leather whip. Every morning, the person had to whip their own back, and the drops of blood that flowed were seen as a sign of purification. Some people repeated this act daily, turning it into a penitential habit, until their backs were covered with a web of old and new scars, and their bodies were bent like a broken branch. It is worth noting that the line between voluntary and forced punishment was extremely thin. There were people who truly believed they had sinned. They loved their husband or wife, but because they had once felt pleasure in their arms, they believed they had offended God. And so, they voluntarily tortured themselves for the rest of their lives just to gain a fragile sense of acceptance by the faith. But the majority of others were victims of coercion. They stood between three irresistible layers of pressure. From the priest came the threat: you must endure this punishment for your soul to have a chance of salvation. From the community came the warning: if you do not atone, we will cast you out of the village. And from the family came the lament: you have shamed the entire clan. You must do something to redeem yourself. When cornered, a person might feel that enduring the whip was easier than facing complete abandonment and isolation. A society ruled by such strict moral laws must have been an incredibly pure society. But the reality was a story full of irony. Who made these laws? It was the priests, the monks, the bishops. And who were the most frequent violators? Ironically, it was them. The stories of the niece living in the priest's house, whose room light was always on late at night, or the story of the orphan in the village with the same eyes and smile as the venerable bishop. The church even imposed a cradle tax, a fine that priests had to pay for having children. The truth revealed a two-faced system. A peasant who hugged his wife too tightly on a holy night might have to fast for 40 days. Meanwhile, a priest who embraced his mistress every night could solve the problem simply by paying a sum of money. Not everyone bowed their heads and accepted this absurdity forever. Gradually, the contradiction between the sermons on the pulpit and the actual behavior of the clergy made people start to whisper. They did not dare to rebel openly, but they began their own resistance. They composed fables, satirical poems, and jokes about the priests. The priest preaches about morality, but forgets to turn off the light in his maid's room. The doctrine forbids love, but his children are more numerous than a peasant's. God sees everything, but it seems he only looks into the houses of the common folk. Those giggles, those whispers in the dark, were the first smoldering embers, laying the foundation for the great religious reforms that would take place in the centuries to come. We've seen love bound by the church's doctrine, scrutinized by the community through thin walls, and trampled by physical punishments. So when faith brought not comfort, but only punishment, where else could people turn? In an era where the soul was monitored by the church, every whisper risked reaching a neighbor's ear, and the body was dissected by healers with theories of hot, cold, wet, dry. It was almost inevitable that marital life would be brought to trial. The bedroom door, already unable to shield against prying eyes, was now thrown open to the public judgment of law and community. But the most terrifying thing was not being sued. The terrifying thing was having to stand before a court where the most private and sensitive issues were dissected before a crowd, with questions and procedures that made the parties involved wish the ground would open up and swallow them into hell right then and there. When thinking about the reasons for divorce or annulment in the Middle Ages, one often imagines issues like adultery, abuse, or complex political calculations. But in reality, one of the most common reasons, recorded in countless church court records, was a very raw issue: the inability to consummate the marriage. According to doctrine, marriage was a sacrament, and its main purpose was procreation, to continue the family line. A marriage not consummated by a physical act was not considered a real marriage. Therefore, the inability to perform was not a personal sorrow, but a solid legal basis for requesting an annulment. The courts were flooded with accusations from both sides. A husband could stand before the court and complain, "Your Honor, my wife has refused to be intimate with me for the past 3 months, making our marriage impossible to complete." A wife could also file a petition with the reason, "Your Grace, my husband is so weak that every time he touches me, he falls asleep. Our marriage has been for 3 years and is still not complete." These kinds of lawsuits, known in history as impotence trials, did not stop at verbal questions and answers. To make a ruling, the court believed that tangible proof was needed. And so, they conducted an inspection. To determine if a man was truly unable to perform, church courts applied public physical examination methods, turning a medical issue into a humiliating spectacle. One of the most common forms was the trial by inspection. A group of examiners, usually consisting of experienced midwives, elderly nuns, and sometimes even a few gentlemen of status in the community, would be appointed to inspect the defendant's instrument. In a cold room, under scrutinizing eyes, they would examine the size, color, and most importantly, the ability to operate and its response to stimuli. If the instrument did not show the necessary hardness, the man would be declared impotent. Important note, the defendant had no right to refuse this examination. Refusal meant tacitly admitting guilt and losing the case. Another method, even more prolonged and mentally torturous, was the 3-night challenge. The couple would be arranged to sleep together in a room for 3 consecutive nights under indirect supervision. After each morning, a midwife or a council of women would privately question the wife. Did anything happen last night? Did you feel anything? If after all 3 nights the answer was still no, the husband would be declared incapable before the entire community. This was a death sentence in terms of face. For a medieval man, it was better to be hanged for theft than to live with the title of useless in the bedroom for the rest of his life. History has recorded lawsuits that were both absurd in procedure and filled with human suffering. The case between Pierre and Marguerite in 13th century France is an example. Marguerite sued her husband for being unable to achieve an erection for 5 years of marriage. In court, Pierre protested, claiming he was not impotent, but was just frightened by his wife and thus unable to perform. The court ordered Pierre to prove his ability before a panel of examiners. As a result, Pierre failed miserably. Marguerite was allowed to annul the marriage and marry someone else. In the final verdict, the court wrote a sarcastic conclusion. This man has a good heart, but his instrument is broken. Another case in 15th century England between Thomas and Eleanor shows another aspect. Eleanor sued her husband for being too violent and cruel in bed. Thomas defended himself by saying, "I was just following the Bible, sowing my seed, and fulfilling my duty as a husband." The court, in a rare moment of empathy, concluded, "A husband's duty does not mean he is allowed to use violence on his wife as if he were butchering a sheep." As a result, Eleanor was allowed to live separately, an extremely rare and progressive verdict at the time. However, in most cases, the woman was always at a disadvantage. If a husband sued his wife for refusing relations, he had a 70% chance of winning. Conversely, if a wife wanted to sue her husband, she had to provide evidence with blood, tears, and dozens of testimonies from others. Some women were even forced to prove that they still had desire, that the fault is not on my side, to rule out the possibility that she was bewitched or had ill will towards her husband. This was no longer a trial, but it turned into a physical and mental interrogation in the name of morality and law. In these bizarre trials, people were not really interested in the couple's love or happiness. What the court and the community wanted to know was, are you fulfilling your duty of procreation and continuing the family line? Are you abiding by the moral rules of the church? Are you bringing shame to your family and community? The bed, which should have been the most private and softest place, had become a piece of legal evidence, an arena of honor, and a public moral scorecard. So in the end, did anyone really win in these trials? The husband won the case and was allowed to remarry, but would live the rest of his life with the rumor that he had to mate under the watch of witnesses. The wife was freed from an unfulfilled marriage, but would have to face a lonely life, suspected and gossiped about by society. And the community, after satisfying its curiosity, would abandon these people like a finished comedy. In the end, everyone was a loser. They lost their privacy, their affection, and their faith in human intimacy. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of an era that placed law, religion, and honor above love. You might ask, so did medieval people ever get to love like normal human beings? Was there ever a time, amidst all the barriers, the trials, and the teachings, that true love still blossomed? The answer is yes. Rare, small, silent, but that's what makes it hauntingly beautiful. In the next chapter, we will tell of clandestine loves, of elopements in the night, of letters never dared to be sent, and of the final embrace before being separated by the flames of the pyre. A fitting end to a chronicle full of tragedy and longing. Throughout the past chapters of this journey, we have walked together through the darkest memories of bedroom history. We have seen straw beds, lying next to snorting livestock in the night. We have heard the admonitions from the church, heavy as hammer blows on the dreams of private happiness. We have witnessed public, humiliating punishments for a touch too warm, and bizarre trials that turned the bed into a witness stand. After all that, one final question remains. Was there any room left for love? The answer is yes. But it was a love that had to go through the hell of prohibition and fear just to exist. A love that did not burn brightly like a great fire, but smoldered like embers on a winter's night. In remote villages, where the priest's gaze could not reach every corner, where bishops were busier with more important documents, there were still people who loved each other in their own way. Their love was not certified by a marriage certificate, nor was it witnessed by anyone. It existed through silent signals. It was a furtive, hurried glance through a fence as the other was drawing water from the village well. It was a small pebble quietly placed on the other's doorstep, like an unspoken message. I am still here, still thinking of you. It was a rendezvous at dawn, when the whole village was still asleep, just to hold hands under the cold moonlight for a few brief moments before returning to real life. They needed no sacred ceremony to know they belonged to each other. Their vow was silence, and their embrace trembled with both cold and fear. But in that silence and trembling, their love was real. In an era when most of the population was illiterate, love could not be confessed through letters full of beautiful words. But being unable to write did not mean being unable to express. They wrote to each other with symbols that only the two of them understood. It could be a wildflower pressed dry in a page of the Bible, a botanical letter that never faded. It was a handkerchief washed cleaner than usual, then accidentally dropped in front of the loved one's house. It was a familiar folk song, but sung today with a different sentiment at the market, and in a distant corner, someone else heard it and knew that song was for them. Perhaps in their entire lives, they never said the 3 words, I love you. But the entire community, with an invisible sensitivity, implicitly understood that something existed between those 2 people. A love that was not allowed to be named. When the pressure from family and society became unbearable, a few brave couples chose the most radical form of rebellion, elopement. They disappeared together on a moonless night, seeking refuge in dense forests, in wild lands, living on wild vegetables, and hunting, just to have one thing: to hold each other without fear of judgment, to live together without anyone's permission. Others chose a more sophisticated solution. They pretended to be cousins, or distant relatives living together under one roof. They shared their lives in silence, but their souls understood each other better than any couple joined by a priest. They were the real-life versions of Romeo and Juliet, but their story was never written into a play because they did not want to become legends. They only longed for something simple, to be ordinary people in an extraordinarily cruel age. And then there were loves that had to pay the ultimate price. Did you know that many women accused of being witches and sent to the stake were not condemned because they had magical powers, but simply because they dared to live differently? They were condemned for refusing to marry the man their parents had chosen. They were condemned for daring to live alone, free with their own bodies. They were condemned for being discovered loving someone of the opposite sex or the same sex in a way that was non-standard. The accusations were thrown. She used witchcraft to seduce men. Or he must be possessed because at his age he still refuses to marry. And so the fire was lit. Their love turned to ash. Afterward, no one dared to speak their names again. But in the darkness, there were still those who secretly kept a lock of hair, a half-burnt piece of cloth from the deceased. They kept it as a sacred relic, as a silent reminder to themselves and to future generations. We once loved, though we were killed, though we were forgotten. We once loved. If you think our story has reached the ultimate depth of prohibition, you are mistaken. Because beneath the layers of hell we have passed through, the hell of poverty, of dogma, of rumors and public trials, there is still a deeper hell. It is the place for loves that were not only considered sinful, but were seen as an abomination, an offense against the very order of creation. That is the silent, trembling, and tragic world of same-sex love. The church used the most terrifying words to condemn it. Unnatural sin, the act of Sodom, the ultimate depravity. In the penitentials, it was ranked among the most serious sins, and the punishment was not just whipping or fasting, but often the flames of the pyre. But laws, no matter how harsh, could not extinguish something that already existed in the human heart. It could only force love to wear a mask. In closed monasteries, where men lived completely separate from women, deep relationships blossomed. They called it special brotherhood. Love letters were written not on ordinary paper, but on the pages of Bibles, using an invisible ink that only appeared when heated over a flame. Words of love were disguised as theological commentary. A touch on a brother's shoulder during prayer could carry more meaning than an hour-long sermon. They were spiritual brothers, but in the long, lonely nights, under the flickering candlelight, they found in each other a comfort that God seemed to have denied them. Similarly, in castles and palaces, where noble women were often left alone when their husbands went to war for years, bosom friendships were formed. Two women could be devoted to each other, sharing a bed, reading books together, embroidering together. They gave each other small gifts, a lock of hair, a brooch, a pressed rose. Society looked on and saw only an innocent female friendship. But only they knew that in the tighter-than-usual hugs, in the gazes that lingered a little too long, a passionate love was burning. They had no language to name their relationship, because their world did not even acknowledge its existence. Because there was no language, they had to create codes. It could be a folk song, sung with a slightly different melody, a way of wearing a ring on a certain finger, or the use of a specific flower in decoration. These were signals that only those in the know could recognize each other in a crowd. It was like a secret society of exiled hearts, a silent recognition among people who shared a secret that could cost them their lives. And that fear was real. History has recorded trials where Knights Templar were accused of sodomy and brutally tortured, or cases where two men were discovered sleeping together in an impure manner and were burned alive together. The fire not only consumed their bodies, it was also a warning to all who dared to stray from the prescribed path. Therefore, their love had to take place in the safest of guises. Two men could declare themselves sworn brothers, living and working together, caring for each other in old age. The whole village would praise their brotherhood without knowing that, behind closed doors, they were a real couple. Two women could open a tailor shop or an inn together, living as unmarried spinsters. People would pity their fate without knowing that they had found happiness and fulfillment with each other. It was a love built on a foundation of silence and extraordinary courage. The courage to love someone the whole world said you were not allowed to love. The courage to act out a play every day, to wear a mask. And the courage to know that, if the secret was exposed, the only person who could stand by your side at the stake was the one you loved most. Between the church's command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth on one hand, and the harsh reality of mouths to feed in a poor peasant family on the other, the medieval woman was trapped in a silent war. It was a war to gain control over the only thing that truly belonged to her, her own body. And in that war, she had to resort to secret remedies, knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, a world of herbs, charms, and beliefs that were both astonishingly creative and deadly dangerous. This was a world where medicine and magic were intertwined. It was believed that to avoid pregnancy, a woman could wear a charm made from the testicles of a weasel, dried and wrapped in a piece of deerskin. The logic behind it was simple. The weasel is not a very fertile animal, so its energy could help suppress a woman's fertility. Another method, recorded in many ancient medical texts, was to use beaver testicles, ground into a powder, mixed with wine, and drunk. But it wasn't just charms. They also had more mechanical methods. People used sponges soaked in vinegar or lemon juice, then inserted them into the body to create an acidic environment that could kill sperm. Others used beeswax, softening it and shaping it into a small cap to block the way. These were the earliest versions of the diaphragm, created from materials available in the kitchen. Herbs also played a crucial role. Pennyroyal, tansy, or cottonroot were names whispered in the private conversations of women. They boiled them into concentrated liquids and drank them after intercourse. Some of these herbs actually worked. They could cause uterine contractions and prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. But the dosage was an extremely dangerous issue. Too little had no effect. Too much could cause poisoning, internal bleeding, and even death. Every time she drank a cup of the forbidden medicine, a woman was not only facing sin before God, but was also gambling with her own life. Besides these, there were methods based on actions and beliefs. It was believed that if a woman jumped backward 7 steps immediately after intercourse, or sneezed forcefully, she could expel the semen from her body. Some healers even advise that if a woman wanted to avoid pregnancy, she should go to a weeping willow tree, break a branch, and whisper her wish to it. Why did they have to do this? Because another child could mean the whole family would starve in the coming winter. Because another childbirth could take the mother's life. And because sometimes they simply did not want to. They wanted a year of rest. They wanted their bodies to recover. They wanted to love their husbands without constantly worrying about the consequences. The church vehemently condemned all these practices. They called it murder, an interference with God's sacred plan. A woman discovered using contraceptive methods could be heavily fined, forced to do public penance. But the church's prohibition could not overcome the destitution of the kitchen. And so, the forbidden remedies were still quietly brewed in the dark. The charms were still secretly worn under clothes, and the whispers about how to control the body were still passed down from one generation to the next. It was a silent rebellion, a desperate and courageous struggle of anonymous women who dared to say, "This body is mine." In medieval society, a contradiction existed openly and ironically. On one hand, the church preached about purity, about the sin of lust, and placed a woman's chastity on a pedestal. On the other hand, that same society allowed, managed, and even taxed an industry built entirely on the trade of physical intimacy, the brothels. Why this paradox? The answer lies in a brutally pragmatic mindset. St. Augustine and many other thinkers argued that prostitution, though an evil, was a necessary evil. It was like a sewer in a magnificent palace. If you block the sewer, the entire palace will be flooded with filth and stench. Similarly, if you completely eliminate prostitution, then the uncontrollable desires of men will be redirected towards decent women, wives, daughters, widows, and that would collapse the social order. Therefore, to protect the chastity of one group of women, society accepted the sacrifice of another group. And so, instead of prohibition, the authorities in many cities chose to manage it. They designated separate red light districts, usually located in small alleys near the port or on the outskirts of the city. Brothels were licensed to operate and had to comply with strict regulations. The brothel owner, usually an older woman called a madam, had to register the names of all the girls working for her with the authorities. They had to pay taxes in full, and part of that tax money, ironically, was used to fund monasteries or church construction projects. The life of a prostitute was tightly controlled. They had regulated working hours, usually from dusk until midnight. They were forbidden from soliciting clients outside the red light district. They had to wear a special type of clothing to distinguish themselves from other women, such as a yellow hood or a red band on their sleeve. The prices for services were also clearly regulated, and sometimes clients could pay in kind, such as a few eggs, a chicken, or a jug of wine. And the role of the church in this was truly astonishing. Publicly, they condemned prostitution as a sin. But in reality, many brothels were built on land owned by the church or monasteries. The church leased the premises, collected rent regularly, and turned a blind eye to what went on inside. They justified it by saying that the dirty money, once collected, would be used for clean purposes, such as helping the poor or building churches. For the girls in this profession, Life was a series of risks. They faced disease, violence from clients, and the contempt of the entire society. But for many, it was the only choice. They could be widows with no support, girls disowned by their families for losing their chastity, or peasants so poor they had to sell their daughters. The brothel, though a squalid place, at least gave them a roof over their heads and a meal. And so, the oldest profession in the world continued to exist as an indispensable but always hidden part of society. It was a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of the era, the hypocrisy of morality, gender inequality, and the truth that sometimes, to keep one part of society clean, people were willing to push another part to the very bottom of the mud. My dear friend, medieval love had no scented candles, no Valentine's Day, no lavish garden weddings, but it had things that modern love sometimes lacks. It had ultimate recklessness, absolute loyalty, and a fierce belief that humans were not born to live alone, and that no one deserves to tremble in fear just for loving the wrong way, the wrong person, or at the wrong time. It was a love that did not need to be written, because it was felt with the whole soul. A love that did not live in dusty history books, but in the memory and flesh of those who dared to love. A love that was forbidden, yet stubbornly sprouted through the cracks of a harsh civilization. Thank you for joining me on this long and dark journey. In our modern world, where we can freely choose whom we love, let's remember that this is not a given. It is the result, bought with the tears and lives of thousands who had to love in the dark, so that one day their descendants could love in the light. And if tonight you are lying in a clean bed, in a quiet room, holding the hand of the one you love without fear, know this: you are living the dream of an entire era. Good night.